definition of terrorism, that is a $64,000 question. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, who was British ambassador to the UN, tried to put a resolution through with the US on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and there was no definition of terrorism in there. And the other countries at the UN Security Council said, well, what's your definition of terrorism? He said, it's like an elephant. We all know it when we see it. Of course, it's not that simplistic. People have different definitions. Governments have different definitions. The British government has redefined it several times over the last 10, 20 years. My own definition would be the use of violence against civilians, against non-combatants for political purposes. Of course, that's a quite controversial definition because that would then bring governments into the definition of terrorism. We tend not to define governments as terrorists. State terrorism never really gets a look in, and therefore it's often described, for example, in the US, they add in the line by subgroups. In order to make clear that they're not talking about governments. But I think, look, most people would accept that if you blow people up or kill innocent civilians to make a political point, that is terrorism.
Being a prominent Muslim figure in the media, do you believe your faith promotes violence and terrorism?
Shock, horror, surprise, surprise. No, I don't, because if it did, then I probably wouldn't be an adherent of that faith. No, I don't believe that at all. In fact, I've written extensively on this subject. I wrote a column recently about how the jihadists who are going out to fight in Syria and Iraq for ISIS and other such groups tend not to have a clue about Islam. You know, there were two guys who came back, were prosecuted in the Midlands, British-born Muslims who went out to fight for ISIS, and in the trial it emerged that the two books they bought before they left on Amazon were Quran for Dummies and and Islam for Dummies, sorry. There isn't a jihad for dummies as far as I'm aware. But those are the books they bought. So I think that speaks volumes about how the religious stuff comes later as a kind of cover for your actions. These guys are motivated by a range of political, social, economic, psychosocial, foreign policy factors, and religion plays a role. But to pretend that Islam motivates people to become terrorists is a complete fallacy. And I think journalists and academics and experts are now starting to say that more. I think it's becoming more common for people to push back against that trope.
What is the actual cause of terrorism and how do you think it should be tackled?
These are $64,000 sweeping questions. I wish I had the answers to all of these. There is no single cause for terrorism. It depends what conflict you're in, what country you're in, what era you're in. There are a variety of factors that leads to someone becoming radicalized or turning towards violence. In fact, most experts like Mark Sageman, the former CIA forensic psychiatrist and profiler, he says that he doesn't even accept there is such a thing as radicalization. He makes the point that there is no accepted consensus view on why someone, even with the most extreme beliefs, takes that final step towards translating those beliefs into violent action. We're actually quite far away from understanding why it is that people turn to violence. We still don't really know why they take that extreme final step. In terms of kind of root causes, which is a phrase that's often used, there's a variety of things. If you look at young men going out to fight from Britain, a lot of them are disillusioned, a lot of them are alienated from society, a lot of them have no hope or ambition in their lives. They are, Chris Morris, the writer of Four Lions, famously said terrorism is about ideology, but it's also about Burkes. It's also about idiotic, rather closed-minded young men with nothing better to do with their time, looking for glamour, looking for excitement, looking for a cause. It's much better to be, in some people's views, unfortunately, it's much better to be standing in the desert with a knife to someone's throat, addressing the President of the United States directly, live on the internet, than it is to be a kind of assistant store manager in Primark in Portsmouth. And, with the great respect to Primark, that probably isn't the most, ambitious or electrifying or exciting thing you want to do with your life. Now, we have to find a way to give young men, and they do tend to be young men, more hope and a better reason for not joining these extremist groups. But let's be very clear, what we call terrorism today, there's a lot of commonality. The reason why people join terrorist groups today is why they joined gangs yesterday, is why they joined anarchist groups in the 60s and 70s, or Marxist groups in Europe, or the IRA. I mean, there's very, very similar causes and factors to do with alienation and anger and looking for some kind of new identity. Do I believe the governments of the US and UK benefit from global terrorism? Not in a kind of conspiratorial, they're behind the attacks, which is a very common trope, unfortunately, in some Muslim communities, which is the Israeli government did 9/11, the American government did 9/11, it was an inside job, the British government did 7/7 in order to make the case for foreign wars. No, I don't believe that. That's nonsensical, it's naive, there's zero evidence for it. What I would say about benefit is it's clearly the case that certain vested interests do well out of foreign conflicts. That's indisputable. In fact, a Foreign Office official once said to me, she said with a straight face, that war is good for the economy. There are, if you're an arms seller, if you're a defence manufacturing company, your stock prices tend to go up in times of war. If you're part of the so-called terrorism industry, if you're one of these experts who turns up on Sky News or CNN to pontificate about Islamism or Sayyid Qutb or Hezbollah or whatever it is, you do well out of foreign wars. If you are a part of the homeland security industry in America, selling security apparatus to governments, you do well out of foreign wars. If you're the media love a good foreign war. It's great to cover, it's exciting, it's glamorous, it's adventurous, it's good for ratings. Now, that doesn't mean that any of these vested interests are behind terrorist attacks. That's a bit Hollywood-esque and mad and conspiratorial for my liking. But clearly, there is a vested interest in hyping things up. You look at terrorism itself. Why is it so hyped up by the media? It is hyped up by the media. The fact is that if you're an American, for example, you're petrified about being killed by Al-Qaeda, and yet you're more likely to drown in your bathtub than you are to be killed by a terrorist. You're more likely to be hit by a bolt of lightning than be killed by a terrorist. You're more likely to be killed by an asteroid hitting the planet Earth than you are to be killed by a terrorist group on US soil. That's what the statistics show. And yet we arrange our whole lives, how we fly, how we take security measures in public places, all based around this terrorist threat. Billions of dollars are made. In Nebraska, I read that there was an anti-terrorist fence built around a hospital. In North Carolina, I believe there were cows that were protected from a biological attack by Al-Qaeda. It's kind of bizarre and weird places where there's never really going to be any kind of terrorist attack. People are spending millions of dollars protecting against it. So clearly, for some people, there is a benefit in all this fear and hyping and scaremongering.